Hello all, and welcome to our third and final segment on the first movement of Mozart's third violin concerto, where we're going to talk about the cadenza, namely what do we do with it. So, the cadenzas that are most often played today are from the late 19th, early 20th century, names like Isai, Auer, Franco, which are wonderful in their own right and, in a sense, also historical testaments to what people were thinking about Mozart cadenzas in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But they don't really conform to what we can ascertain would have been Mozart's performance and improvisation practice in the area of cadenzas. So, of course, that raises the question, how can we have a sense of what Mozart's performance or improvisation practice would have been? How might Mozart have improvised a cadenza? Well, thankfully, he actually wrote out some cadenzas to a number of movements of his piano concertos. They're all online on IMSLP. I can put a link to that below. And he also wrote out cadenzas for the Sinfonia Concertante for violin and viola. The first two movements have cadenzas that Mozart supplied. We don't have any violin concerto movements as such, but what we do have can give us some helpful clues as we approach the question of how to play or improvise a cadenza. So some principles that we can draw from those. In general, they're shorter than we tend to find in the 19th century. Originally, the principle behind a cadenza was that it should be able to fit in a singer's single breath. Now, that's long gone, in a sense, by Mozart's time, but this idea of a single unity, something that doesn't ramble too much, is still there. We still kind of, in all of Mozart's cadenzas, we have this sense of architecture. There's a very definite beginning, middle, and end. And beyond that, it's hard to kind of pin down what characterizes each. Sometimes it dives right in with something that's either thematic or feels, or will be kind of thematic for the cadenza. Sometimes it starts with something very free, but one way or another, we have a feeling like we're starting out, and then we have something in the middle of the cadenza. Maybe we spin an idea out a little bit more, a sequence, something like that, and then end. Maybe sometimes more rhapsodic figuration, sometimes there's a short adagio, sometimes there are a couple of fermatas, but something to give us a sense of beginning, middle, and end. I know that's awfully abstract. The point, though, is that we want it to feel like a single unified entity within a length that's a bit shorter than we're going to find in the 19th century. I think related to this idea of unity and continuity is the fact that Mozart's cadenzas don't really change key, unlike the generation after. Beethoven changes key in his cadenzas, and I think part of that was playing against this tradition of not changing key, right? Because now with Beethoven, audiences are expecting to hear a cadenza that does not change key, that stays in the same key, and he suddenly goes off into a very different key, and we're left to think, oh my goodness, how's he going to get back home, right? So I think we understand Beethoven's practice and the whole practice of changing key in a cadenza better when we understand that in Mozart's time, they wouldn't have changed key. Now, sometimes Mozart will tonicize, kind of locally tonicize something, or go sometimes fairly extensively into the parallel minor, and through that he'll sometimes emphasize flat six. So, for example, if you're in C major, sometimes he'll put us into the distant sounding key of A flat. Really, but what that is we've just gone into C minor, and then A flat is very closely related to that. So he'll sometimes spin us around, but then always wind us up back in C major, and we realize, oh, you know what? We never actually really changed key. That's a fairly common technique that Mozart uses, going into the flat six via the parallel minor, and then back to the home key. Okay, so toward the end of this video, I was going to mention that I had supplied some cadenzas for Mozart's third, fourth, and fifth concertos. If you check those out, you'll notice that in the cadenza to the first movement of the fifth concerto, I actually go fairly far afield tonally, it looks like. Just kind of as a caveat, I'm taking advantage of another notion from Mozart's time, which was that when you're in the midst of a sequence, the harmonies aren't really observed as being functional in relation to the home key. It's the sequence kind of has its own logic, and then you resume the analysis relative to the home key once you land out of that. So I take us, it looks like, a little bit further afield, and then I do a harmonic switcheroo that would have been very familiar to Mozart, and, bingo, we're in the home key. Admittedly, it's probably more the kind of harmonic play that Mozart would have done later in his life rather than at the age of 19 when he wrote the concerto. So, I hope you'll forgive me. But that's what's going on there. Okay, so we've got cadenzas that are shorter than in the 19th century, have a sense of architecture, beginning, middle, and end, don't really change key. They're also not loaded with thematic material. Sometimes more recent cadenzas, since the 19th century, have tried to kind of cram in as many thematic ideas as we can. And one interesting example of that, a very clever example of that, is in Kreisler's cadenza to the Beethoven concerto, where he actually combines two motifs together. Some of you may be familiar with that. Very clever, but not the kind of thing that we're probably going to find in a cadenza of Mozart's time. The most compositionally complex thing that I can think of is probably the beginning of the second movement of the Sinfonia Concertante, from later in Mozart's life. Mozart's all too short life, so it's funny to talk about later in his life, but where you have an imitation between the violin and viola. So you can hear them kind of going back and forth again. That's divided between two instruments. I just don't have two instruments here. But that's really as compositionally complex as it gets. The emphasis of Mozart's concertos is usually much more on kind of rhapsodic figuration, to the point where he will actually allow himself the freedom to change key signatures as he's writing it out. If the kind of free rhapsodic figuration doesn't quite fit into the metrical box, he changes the box, right? So that's a possibility as well. We do have of that sort of freedom. So here's where things get a little interesting with Mozart's cadenzas. They're actually, to my perception, quite tame, which is funny because Mozart had a reputation for being a wild a brilliant improviser. And in fact, you find much more dramatic and brilliant figuration throughout the piano concertos, sonatas, and these sorts of things. But what is actually found in his cadenzas, is rather tame, and that makes sense if we consider that cadenzas in Mozart's time were usually improvised, right? So if he's writing a cadenza out, it's very likely for a student or for someone else who isn't yet advanced enough to really own a cadenza and improvise it, make it up for themselves. So it's very likely that Mozart was actually writing something fairly simple, a bit formulaic for someone who wasn't really able to improvise their own cadenza yet. So I think if we understand that will give us a little bit more leeway to pursue the kind of brilliance that Mozart himself would probably improvise in a cadenza. So that touches a little bit on the question of how do we treat a violin cadenza if no violin cadenzas of Mozart survive. We know that Mozart was, quote, no lover of difficulty on the violin. He was obviously a very good violinist, right? He wrote these concertos for himself to play, and they're not easy music. But at the same time, the piano, the keyboard instruments, that was his first occupation, really, from an instrumental perspective. I mean, that was his first instrument. So I think the question we can ask ourselves is how might cadenzas have been played by a Mozart whose first instrument was the violin? Now, how do we land at that? Well, we can look at the kind of writing that the virtuoso violinists of shortly before Mozart's time, what sorts of things they were demanding of performers. If you look at Tartini, Leclerc, Locatelli, although Locatelli can get awfully extreme, he does a lot of things which I think would be very out of place in a Mozart concerto or cadenza. But that can be a good starting point to see what was the common parlance among violinists in terms of violin virtuosity. When we look at the violin writing of composers slightly closer to Mozart's generation, Stamitz, Hofmeister, Eck, what we see is that certain things that would not have been common for Tartini and Leclerc are becoming a little bit more common. For example, small shifts in double stops under slurs. You'd be hard-pressed to find that in Tartini. but you'll find it a lot more in some Eck or Hofmeister or Stamm. I can think of examples in all three where that's called for. Nothing as extreme as Paganini, right? Because at this point, the violin still wouldn't have had a chin rest. It would have just looked like this. And in the first video in the series, I talk a little bit more about some of those specific implications. But Paganini, the kind of shifting and whatnot that he requires in double stops, would have, even though he played without a chin rest, when you see the pictures, the drawings and paintings of him, very often the chin is down, and he would really need to be applying more chin pressure to do the kinds of wild up and down shifts that he was doing. I think those sorts of things would have been, and even that sort of a violin hold would have been a bit out of place in Mozart's context. So the cadenzas should be viable on a gut-strung period violin with classical bow. That's another takeaway. And again, feel free to check out the first video where I go into that sort of thing in a bit more detail. One other thing that might be good to keep in mind is that there's a wonderful artist, Jos van Immerzeel, who I believe it's in a publication of Mozart's piano concertos, recording perhaps, where he publishes a list of Mozart's musical rhetorical devices. Very, very interesting. So I would highly recommend that. I can't put my finger on where that is at the moment. But a little bit of digging, you can probably find that, and it's definitely worth consulting, because it can be a good pointer for the kinds of gestures that Mozart uses in what contexts. So this is a little guide to how we can approach the question of cadenzas. As I mentioned earlier, I have put cadenzas to Mozart's 3rd, 4th, and 5th concertos on IMSLP, and you're welcome to consult those to perform them, use them however you like. But yeah, why not write your own, or come up with your own, or if you're so inclined, get used to improvising along these lines so that you can improvise your own in performance. It's quite a challenge that our modern musical training doesn't equip us for so much, but I think it will be one important step toward continuing to recapture the performance practice of this era if we get used to creating cadenzas, and especially improvising cadenzas, along the lines that we've just discussed here. So have fun with that, and hope this is helpful. As always, thanks for watching.